Okay. So, I think just trying to get ready. So, greetings. My name is Scott Grimwood. I'm a member of the SAA's Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group. And thank you for joining the working group's second invited talk on what is trauma-informed archival practice and why we need to implement the practice in archives. The speakers will provide an overview of the 2022 survey, Understanding the International Landscape of Trauma and Archives, which sought to obtain quantitative data to identify how widespread experiences of trauma and archives were and what support was available and what education, training, and resources were needed. Before we introduce the speakers, a little bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be available through the Crisis, Disaster, Tragedy Response Working Group microsite for future viewing. SAA has integrated live captioning for Zoom events using otter.ai. Participants can access the transcript by selecting the drop-down menu in the live box at the top left corner of your Zoom screen. Please note that the transcript will open in a new browser window. As always, please make sure that you are muted during the presentation to avoid interruptions. And we will have time for questions following the presentation. And if you would post your questions in the chat, I'll jot those down and ask them at the end. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's program. We have Kirsten Wright, her pronouns are she and her, is a program manager, Find and Connect web resource, University of Melbourne. Prior to this, she held a number of roles in Victoria University, Australia, including the University Archivist, and also has worked at the Public Record Office of Victoria. She previously published and presented on topics including archives and power, historical language and archival description, trauma-informed archival practice, and out-of-home care records. She is a co-founder of the Trauma-Informed Archives Community of Practice. And the other speaker is Nicola Laurent, pronouns are she and her, is the Senior Project Archivist, Find and Connect web resource at the University of Melbourne. Nicola advocates for trauma-informed archival practice and discusses the impact of various trauma on archivists and received International Council of Archives Program Commission funding to undertake the Understanding the International Landscape of Trauma and Archives project. Nicola is the president of the Australian Society of Archivists, the ICA New Professionals Program Coordinator, and co-founder of the Trauma-Informed Archives Community of Practice. And this will be the last time you hear my voice till the end of the meeting, which I'm sure you're all grateful for. So I will turn it over to you, Kirsten and Nicola.
Hi, everyone. I am just going to share my screen to start off. Great, excellent. So yeah, thank you so much for having us today. We want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands we're on today. We are actually joining you from Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq and part of the peace and friendship treaties signed with the British in the 1700s. And the Mi'kmaq have since asserted that these treaties did not mean surrender, particularly of the land, and that this is unceded territory. And we'd also like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters around Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, where we have conducted most of this work, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. So I am Kirsten Wright. As mentioned, my pronouns are she, her. I have British and American ancestry and have grown up in Australia. And I'm the program manager for the Find and Connect web resource. And I've worked in records management, archives, and freedom of information positions in universities and government archives. And as Scott said, I'm interested in ideas of language and archival description and archives and power. And I think that trauma-informed archival practice is a really useful model through which to consider our work and how it can be improved for everyone.
And hi, everyone. I'm Nicola Laurent. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm from England originally, but have been living in Australia for around 18 years. I'm the Senior Project Archivist for the web resource, and trauma-informed archival practice has been a focus for me in recent years. I advocate for and support the implementation of trauma-informed archival practice, promote sustainable access to online material, and discuss the impact of vicarious trauma on archivists. And I see trauma-informed archival practice as a model to put the focus on people within archives, ensuring best practice access regimes and ethical archive practices are used while supporting everyone who works and uses the archives. So we both wanted to say that we are white, cisgender, middle class, and tertiary educated women and acknowledge the attendant privileges that these identities afford us, both in the world generally and in the archival profession. We also want to say that while we've done a lot of work in this space of trauma and archives, we are not mental health professionals, and we do not advocate for archivists to become mental health workers or social workers. Instead, archivists can learn and apply principles and information from other sectors, as this can provide insight into our work and show how we can all work better and in safer and more empowering ways.
So as mentioned, we both work on the Find and Connect web resource based at the University of Melbourne, and this is funded by the Australian Government Department of Social Services. Find and Connect provides information about out-of-home care in Australia and child welfare. It links together the histories of institutions who provided care with information about who ran them and key events and legislation impacting on the history of out-of-home care in Australia. And we also have a focus on the records of out-of-home care. People who grew up in institutions, so places such as orphanages and children's homes, are reliant on these institutional records to find out information about their childhoods. And these records are held by a vast array of organisations, including government archives, church and charitable organisations, and other cultural institutions. Find and Connect acts as a giant catalogue or finding aid to these records, describing what they are, who holds them, and how to get access to them. To be clear, we don't hold these records ourselves. Instead, we show people how to access what does exist. But Find and Connect is a broader program than only the web resource, with the Australian government also funding support services in each state. Many people had hugely traumatic experiences growing up in care, as is now much better understood, both in the Australian context and internationally also. And because of these traumatic experiences, the Find and Connect support services are required to use a framework of trauma-informed practice. And it was through working with them that we learned about trauma-informed practice, and we saw how useful this could be for archives. So we're going to start today by providing a brief overview of trauma and trauma-informed practice and discuss why this is a useful model for archives. And then we'll go on to talk about our work in this area, including the survey that we ran last year, and highlight some of the results and discuss what this means for the profession more broadly.
So when considering what is trauma, trauma is an emotional response to a deeply distressing event or series of events. And these events do not need to be life-threatening or cause physical harm for there to be serious and ongoing effects. Trauma may be experienced by individuals and communities. And if not provided with opportunities to heal from their trauma, it may also be passed on to others around them, leading to intergenerational trauma. Some common reactions to experiencing trauma include having flashbacks or triggered reactions, changes in outlook on life, invasive thoughts about the trauma event. These reactions may be one-off or may become ongoing and affect all aspects of someone's life. Particularly if the trauma was experienced in childhood, the effects can be long-lasting and complex. And it is now estimated that up to 90% of the population will experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes. And people may experience direct trauma or vicarious trauma. Direct trauma is where an event or situation happens to someone directly. Vicarious trauma occurs when someone has a trauma reaction by being exposed to someone else's trauma or through exposure to traumatic material. And note, we generally use the term vicarious trauma. However, you may also see secondary trauma used to refer to this. And vicarious trauma has long been recognized in the mental health field. However, it has since been acknowledged that it can occur in a variety of settings, including archives. And it's not a sign of weakness. and it is instead an entirely normal response to being exposed to trauma. So what is trauma-informed practice? Recognizing that trauma is pervasive, affects us all, and can lead to lifelong and serious effects. Trauma-informed practice is a strengths-based approach, which can be put into practice in any context. It works to reduce the likelihood of stressful interactions and the effects of any previous trauma on people. Trauma-informed practice acknowledges that every interaction someone has, no matter how small that interaction, it may be positive or negative. Positive interactions of all kinds can help us heal, but negative interactions may make healing further out of reach and make existing emotional and psychological problems worse. Achieving trauma-informed practice involves collaborating with people who have experienced trauma, determining their needs, understanding the environments, behaviours and inputs that may be triggering for them, and from there, developing strategies to avoid re-traumatization. Trauma-informed practice is not about changing what services your organisation provides, but how those services are provided. This means it will also look different in every organisation, as it should be tailored to the needs of your communities, both users and staff. And trauma-informed practice is based on the 5 principles of safety, trust and transparency, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And we don't have a lot of time today to go into detail about each principle, but to note they all work together to create a safe and affirming environment for everyone. That includes staff, volunteers, researchers, donors, and all users of archives. And it can also be used to assess any part of an organization's work to determine where improvements need to be made. And these principles work on both an individual and an organizational level. For example, while working one-on-one with someone, say in a reading room, the principle of choice would mean tailoring the reading room experience so that it is driven by the person's choices, as they are the experts about what is best for them. But on an organizational level, the principle of choice may mean expanding how communities documented in your archives can work with your organization, rather than this engagement process, and the work priorities being used only to benefit the organization. And it's through the application of all the trauma-informed principles, people and communities can feel empowered and affirmed, leading to more positive interactions and more healing.
So what does this mean for archives? We're all aware that archives are key sites of contradiction and affect. Archives are double-edged. They contain critical information for individuals and communities, but information which has often been collected in disturbing and non-consensual ways, including in the cause of racist, eugenicist, and colonial policies. In archives, traumatic materials can refer to information in records, artifacts, or items. So sometimes it is the records themselves that can be the cause of the trauma, and sometimes it's the context in which they're presented. For example, if a record or item is stolen, or if someone is viewing material about specific Indigenous cultural practices that is inappropriate for them to view, this context can lead to trauma. And of course, the record's contents themselves can be hugely traumatic. Records may contain dehumanizing, degrading, or inaccurate language. They may document human rights abuses, surveillance of citizens, or destructive government policies. So we believe that implementing the principles of trauma-informed practice can, over time, create a more trusted environment and ensure that people get access to relevant records in a safe and empowering way. We also believe that implementing the principles of trauma-informed practice can help implement many of the ideas discussed in the archives literature. While discussions around archives, archivists, and trauma are quite new, really only happening in the past, say, 5 years or so, there have been broader discussions of archives and affect and people-centered archives for longer. So centering people, not records, in archival work means understanding that archives and archivists are not neutral, objective actors, that power dynamics are always at play, that key archival concepts need reworking or reconceptualizing, and that liberatory memory work must be at the heart of archival work. So we see trauma-informed archival practice as part of this person-centered archives work, which enables a difficult and affective nature of archives and records to be recognized, and as a way to effect practical change for archives and archivists. We think it assists in the implementation of many of the concepts discussed around radical empathy, participatory co-design, providing access to records in an empathetic and community-focused way, and also provide space to recognise and prevent vicarious trauma. So we're now going to discuss some of our work in this space and the survey that we conducted last year.
So in Australia, an important catalyst was the 2017 conference session at the Australian Society of Archivists conference. And I, along with Nicola Laurent and Kate O'Neill, presented on affect, emotional labour and archives. And this turned into a discussion session where many archivists shared for the first time the emotions they experienced while doing archives work, including those of distress and trauma. And at that time, I was a member of the Council of the Australian Society of Archivists, and I felt that there was a role for the ASA to play as the professional association. The ASA acknowledged the gap in the profession's resources and recognised the need to support their members and the broader profession by creating resources on the topic. And since then, Kirsten and I have been able to develop an online course and a workshop, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And we're also the co-founders with Nicola Laurent of an international peer support group called the Trauma-Informed Archives Community of Practice. And in doing this work, we had heard from many people who had had distressing experiences in archives or had to work on upsetting records. However, we had no statistics or information about how prevalent these experiences were across the archive sector globally. So we're keen to get some of those statistics and more evidence about people's experiences of archives and trauma, and we're able to conduct a survey to help establish this. So last year, we received funding from the International Council on Archives Program Commission to conduct a survey to better understand the international landscape of archives and trauma. It was an anonymous survey and it was available in English, French, and Spanish. And our aim was to gain a global view of issues of archives and trauma from both a quantitative and qualitative perspective. And we were also keen to extend our discussion beyond English-speaking countries. And we have just published a report of the initial findings from the survey, which is available on the ICA website. And it shows that issues of archives and trauma are serious ones for the profession. And the survey was completed in partnership with the ICA section on education and training, and the accompanying recommendations were written for that section with a focus on education and training outcomes.
So to provide a quick overview of the survey structure, we obtained human research ethics approval from the University of Melbourne, and we worked with paid accredited translators to translate the survey questions into French and Spanish, and then the French and Spanish survey responses back into English. The survey was deliberately designed to be anonymous, asking questions about demographics and archival experience, awareness of concepts such as trauma and trauma-informed practice, the prevalence of trauma experiences in archives, sharing experiences and current support available, and the resources, education and training needed to help answer the questions that are listed on the slide. Given the potentially difficult nature of the survey questions, all questions were optional and people could exit the survey at any point. And links to international crisis support lines were included at the start and the end of the survey. And the survey was widely distributed across ICA and other archives networks, and we got a great response far beyond what we were expecting, with over 1,100 people from 100 countries responding. And we do realise that respondents may have been self-selecting, in that if people weren't interested in archives and trauma, they probably wouldn't have completed the survey. But it does show that many people were interested in sharing their experiences and having their voices heard. So we're now going to go into some of the quantitative responses from the survey, and in particular providing an overview of surveys from people who said that they were from the United States, and where relevant also considering comparisons with the global results. So we received 639 responses in English, 251 in French, and 248 in Spanish. So a good distribution across the 3 languages that the survey was available in. And as you can see from the slide, the United States was in the top 10 countries where people responded from overall. And just to simplify how we're sharing these results today, we'll use the term American respondents or results to mean those who identified as living in the United States, and the global responses to refer to everyone who responded to the survey, including the American responses.
So to understand who had responded to the survey, we started with some demographic questions. These questions related to personal and career information to help understand the geographic, cultural, and professional implications of trauma within archives. And as you can see from previous slide, you can see we did get a good response from people around the world. But due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into this section in a lot of detail, but just to confirm that those identifying as living in the US identified as different genders, though predominantly women, worked in a range of organizations, though predominantly university archives, academia, and libraries, which is in contrast to the global results where government archives was the main responder. The size of the archive people worked in varied, as did the amount of experience they had. The type of employment was significantly weighted towards those working full-time. And notably, only 6% of the US responses identified as currently studying a records or archives related course, whereas the global response had 16%. So it means the survey results from the US don't provide us with much insight into current American archival teaching practices. But these responses highlight the range of voices that completed the survey, including the diversity in career experience, location, and background. So moving into addressing the survey results, which considered the current level of awareness of trauma in archives. When asked directly, do you think that people, including staff, volunteers, and users, can experience a trauma reaction in the archives? 95% of the American respondents said yes. And this was just slightly higher than the global response rate. And again, we want to acknowledge that while dissenting views were expressed, people who might not agree with the overall concept of trauma in archives may not have done the survey. But these results still highlight the strong emphasis that most people in the profession think trauma can be experienced in archives. And our next question focused on considering if language such as trauma and trauma-informed is the most appropriate for the archival profession when discussing these topics. And definitions of terms used in these questions were purposefully not included to understand whether people knew these terms prior to undertaking the survey. But from this question, there were clear answers from the American respondents, where 80% felt that these were the best terms. However, globally, 70% of respondents agreed that the language of trauma and trauma-informed was appropriate for archives. And differences will be worth exploring more here in more detail here, particularly when considering differences in language and terminology. So when asked specifically about awareness of trauma-informed practice in archives, 53% of American respondents said that they were not aware, and this was lower than the global response. However, only 19% were not aware that vicarious trauma could be experienced within archives, which was much lower than the global response. So it indicates that most Americans agree that a trauma reaction can occur in archives, and they're also aware of some existing terminology, but perhaps less aware of some of the frameworks or tools to help understand and which may provide support. But the responses to these questions about awareness are particularly unsurprising given the results to our next question, when asked if people were taught about these concepts in their archival education, or if they've been exposed to them since through professional development, training, or further education. So regarding opportunities to learn about these topics, almost all American respondents at 91% were not taught about this during their archival education. But significantly, 53% identified learning about these concepts during professional development, training, or further education. And in the global statistics, we saw a much lower percentage at only 34% of people learning about it as part of further training. But it was a similarly high 92% that identified not learning about it in their education. So this has highlighted that people in America have been exposed to the concepts of trauma-informed practice and vicarious trauma generally more than on an international scale, and specifically through that further training. Most people who live in America believe that people can experience a trauma reaction in the archives. So that means it's going to be critical that these topics become part of education and further embedded in training.
The next section of the survey addressed trauma experiences, asking questions to help quantify the trauma experiences people reported having in archives to help understand how widespread experiences were. And in this section, to ensure that there was no confusion for people who were previously unaware of the terms, a definition of vicarious trauma was provided to assist respondents' understanding. As per the left graph, people were asked if they'd ever been exposed to content that they found distressing or traumatic within archives, and 80% of American respondents said yes, which is higher than the global response. And when looking at the graph on the right, respondents were then asked if they'd been exposed to a situation that they found distressing or traumatic within archives. And 50% of Americans respondents said yes, which was aligned with the global response. And from there, 67% of American respondents and 51% of global respondents reported experiencing vicarious trauma as a result. When asked to consider the experiences of those around them, 38% of people responded that they were aware of an archives user who had experienced a trauma reaction in the archives. And also colleagues, where it increased to 49%, reporting that they're aware of a colleague experiencing a trauma reaction. And so these responses demonstrate that a considerable number of people have experienced trauma in archives, both in America and internationally. And significantly,
Here's what I found.
Responses showed that more people had experienced some form of trauma in archives than those who had not. The fourth section considered how often people share their experiences and the current support structures in place. So when asked if they, their colleague, or an archives user had informed their workplace of the traumatic experience, 28% of Americans said that they had, which is lower than the global response of 35%. And more people, 45% of American respondents, indicated that they had shared this experience with their peers, but this again was lower than the global response. And please note there was an option for people to select unknown or not applicable to these questions because they may not have been aware of how their peers or a user responded. But overall, we are seeing students and new professionals are less comfortable in sharing, and perhaps they know less people to share with. And so these experiences occur more than those and more advanced in their careers. When asked what support was provided to themselves or to their colleagues, and here people could select all relevant results. As you can see from the slide, the first response was no support provided, followed closely by peer support. I need to switch slides. And this differed marginally from the global results, which showed that peer support was first, again, followed by no support provided. When asked who provided support, colleagues and informal support through the workplace provided the most support, followed by friends and family. And this is a meaning that American respondents are reliant on their personal and professional networks for support, but do receive more informal support from their workplaces than their international colleagues identified. And it's evident across all results that people were more likely to tell their peers than management or their workplace formally about a distressing or traumatizing experience in the archives.
And the final section of the survey was focused on helping us understand if different education, resources, and training were needed and wanted. So now we're moving to looking forward to what support people would like to see and whether they think these topics should be included in archival education. And when asked what support would you like to see for issues of archives and trauma, and again, people could select all that apply, American responses were similarly aligned to the global responses, with most identifying training as a support mechanism, then followed by counselling, then followed by peer support. Additionally, 71% of American respondents and 80% of global respondents identified formal support through workplaces as their preferred support provider. And this was followed by over 65% identifying professional associations as a preferred support provider. And then Americans selected informal support through the workplace, whereas international colleagues did not choose that as their third option. So what this suggests is a move away from current approaches and the reliance on peers and colleagues. And we see respondents looking for training and counselling to be provided formally through workplaces. This represents a significant shift in responses to these issues, with leadership being required from managers in workplaces, professional associations, and archival educators and trainers. And when asked how important it was to include the topics of vicarious trauma, trauma-informed archival practice, and support mechanisms within formal archival education courses, most American respondents thought it was important to include all three topics. A distinction is the importance level that people identified they should be included, with people from America aligning it a bit more with being moderately important in comparison to the global results where people identified it as being very important. However, it all really highlights the need to include these topics within archival education. So to assist with how to respond, these are the recommendations we provided to the International Council on Archives section for archival education and training. And this came out of the overall or the global survey results. And again, to note, these are primarily focused on archival education and training, but they're underpinned by the underlying principle of all in the archival profession need to be aware of the potential for trauma in archives. So the three recommendations are: raise awareness of trauma, trauma-informed practice, and vicarious trauma. Promote the inclusion of trauma, trauma-informed practice, and vicarious trauma as topics in archival education programs. And third, develop and provide training and professional development materials on trauma, trauma-informed practice, and vicarious trauma. And we see important roles for both archival educators and professional associations to better prepare new people coming into the profession and to better support and provide better support to those already working, and also for organizations to enable access and to this support and training. But we know that there's still a long way to go in terms of understanding and maturity levels around these topics, but we hope these recommendations and the survey results more broadly will be a useful advocacy tool to not only raise awareness of issues of trauma in archives, but also to make practical changes to improve experiences for staff and users of archives. And in this last part of the talk, we wanted to highlight some existing resources and responses which you might find useful, and consider what other or further changes are needed, both within individual organizations and within the profession as a whole.
So as mentioned earlier, in Australia, we've been able to develop resources through the Australian Society of Archivists, who saw that it was part of their role to support their members in this area. So we first developed an online course, and now we also run workshops on implementing trauma-informed archival practice. So the online course is self-directed, takes about 3 hours to complete in total, and it's designed to support people working or volunteering in archives so that they feel empowered to start having conversations around trauma-informed practice and vicarious trauma at the places that they work, and for organisations to recognise that these issues require organisational responses rather than it being the responsibility of individuals. And the workshops go into more detail about participant situations to discuss real life scenarios based on their current context, and to develop strategies and ideas to take back to their workplaces around the issue of trauma-informed practice. And we have run a few of these in American-friendly time zones. It's an early start for us, but we do that. And so we have already had some participants from the US and Canada, which has been great.
So the peer support trauma-informed archives community of practice has had a great response. We established a Discord server to act as a central point for resources and discussion, and we hold regular meetings. The meetings are generally themed and involve 3 to 4 short talks by members and time for discussion. And examples of previous meeting themes have been advocating to management, supporting users and researchers when accessing traumatic content, and self-care. And we are having our next meeting in early August, and we'll be highlighting former students and recent graduates who have done research in the areas relevant to trauma and archives. But this community of practice is deliberately not under the auspices of any organisation, and instead it was our hope and intention that it would be driven by members and run in ways that suited them best, using the peer support model. But we've also seen a number of responses from other professional archival associations, including the creation of resources for their members and those in the profession more broadly to use to best prevent and respond to emotional situations when they arise. And of course, include the SAA Crisis, Disaster and Tragedy Response Working Group, which is a really useful resource. We always refer people to it.
Yeah.
I also developed a really short page for the Australian Society of Archivists, specifically on vicarious trauma, its effect, and identifies some simple techniques and responses to use in the moments following exposure to traumatic material or situations. And we see a significant role for professional associations in continuing to create professional development resources and creating spaces to facilitate discussions in this area. and advocating for archives as being safe spaces for all. And this includes raising awareness and helping to educate organisations about their responsibilities in this area.
So turning briefly to how organisations can support their staff, it's important for all places where archivists work, whether they are standalone archives or archivists working in larger organisations, to recognise that they, as workplaces, have responsibilities to ensure a safe environment. They are responsible for implementing trauma-informed practice and making the changes required, including some potentially large cultural changes. And they are responsible for keeping their workers safe and supported, and to provide support around issues of vicarious trauma. In relation to vicarious trauma, we want to emphasise that this needs to be treated like the occupational health and safety issue that it is. Organisations are generally very good at ensuring employee safety when it comes to manual handling, making sure that there are ladders and trolleys and lifting aids. And they are also responsible for this aspect of staff psychological safety. And we know it isn't possible to ensure that no one ever suffers vicarious trauma. So instead, organisations should work to best support their workers when issues of vicarious trauma come up. Normalising discussions of mental health, emotional labour, and vicarious trauma is an important step in ensuring people can get the help that they need. So some things organisations can do is provide training opportunities for staff around issues of vicarious trauma and mental health more broadly. They can enable staff to prioritise self-care, make it clear that self-care is an accepted part of work practice, and with time for self-care built into project planning and work planning. If possible, workers can be rotated, so it's not all the same person having to deal with the same traumatic material. This may not be possible in all environments, but should be considered if it is. And on the issue of trauma-informed practice more broadly, organisations can use the framework and the 5 principles that we discussed to critically examine any aspects of their operations. While an archives reading room is an obvious place to start, any part of an archives work, from cataloguing and description to the building to a web presence, governance arrangements, can all be assessed using a trauma-informed approach, and from there determining changes to make. So there are concrete changes that organisations can make to move towards a trauma-informed practice. Some of these are very large and, these big cultural changes, and some are only small. But we encourage all organisations to consider what is possible in this area.
So to conclude, what is next for us, we'll continue to actively disseminate the survey results to a wider audience and further analyse and share the generous responses to the survey. We'll also continue to deliver the Australian Society of Archivists workshop and support the trauma-informed archives community of practice. Finally, following the results from the survey, I received a second round of ICA Program Commission funding to support the development of a template on vicarious trauma that organisations can take and modify for their own circumstances. And this will provide basic information about vicarious trauma in archives, but allow for organisations to add in information specific to them. And we hope this type of template will also work to normalise these topics and discussions in workplaces and show organisations how they can start actively supporting people. So thank you so much for having us today. We hope you found this an interesting outline of our work in the space of trauma-informed archival practice and found the overview of the survey responses interesting, and that this helps you to consider what work we all need to do to make the archives safer places for all. So thank you.
Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
And I am back. So we do have one question, and if anybody else has any other questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to read the question. It's from Costas. I will read it verbatim. Thank you very much, both. Extremely useful. Did your survey or your other work look at the interaction between archivists and members of the public in cases of traumatic archives? Should this be included in any training that organizations develop?
Yeah, so I think that this really comes through in the question where we asked if people had experienced a traumatic situation in archives. So that's kind of why we asked about the content and then a situation. There is a lot of free text responses that we received. Yeah. So under those questions, we asked people if they felt comfortable to share those responses, and they are something we haven't really yet had the opportunity to delve into. So we're really expecting that to come out in the future. But absolutely, I think it's going to be really important that this is included in the training. Certainly just looking at the numbers, enough people have been, have been in situations that they thought were uncomfortable, that it's got to be an important part of training moving forward.
Yeah, and I think, in current, or I'll say when I did the archives education course, which was many years ago now, but the emphasis was really on sort of the reference interview and the reading room context only. And I think in terms of ongoing training, I think, it needs to be, in terms of those interactions between people coming into the archives, members of the public and staff, it needs to be a lot broader. And I think it needs to acknowledge that often there are ongoing relationships that are built both between individuals and then on a community level, and that these need to be considered and sort of nurtured and understood as part of archives work as well. So yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, any other questions, folks? I haven't seen anything else in the chat.
Oh, it looks like there's one from Caroline.
Oh, I'm not seeing it, but if you can see it, please go ahead and respond.
Caroline has asked, do we have any plans to expand the survey to include more languages and nationalities? Which I'm just laughing at because,
we did get a few responses like when it was open. So we did it in the English, French and Spanish because they're the 3 languages that the International Council on Archives use as their kind of official languages. And so the survey went out in that, and the report's gone out in that, in those languages as well. But we did have people write to us and say, oh, if it could be in Portuguese, if it could be in Chinese, like we would really be able to expand that. So at the moment, no, because there's no further funding. But I think certainly there's a real interest there, and it would be something we should definitely look at doing. We've been really surprised by the survey results. Like we said, part of the reason we did this was because we wanted to open the conversation beyond the ones we were able to have being both English only speakers. And we've seen from the results that this is absolutely a global issue, but there are some specifics in terms of terminology and language to explore. So I think the more that we can do this, the better that will be. So yes, hopefully.
I think as well, what was really, the people responding to the survey were really generous. It was very clear that there were people responding, in their second, third, fourth languages, because they obviously felt really, compelled. They really wanted to participate, even though it may not have been available in their sort of first language. So that was really, really wonderful to see as well. Yeah.
We have a new question here from Eleanor McKenzie. Thank you both for the talk. You mentioned that you don't advocate for archivists providing psychological support or becoming mental health professionals. Do you have any suggestions on how archivists or services can implement this and build these boundaries in a profession, but in a respectful way? Many archives users want to share their personal stories and seek immediate support when viewing traumatic material.
Yeah, a great question. And something that's definitely on our minds, I think, when we do this work. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, we absolutely don't want to take over, the professional roles of another field. That's not our job. We get annoyed when people think they can do archives work. We don't, I think it's the same for these other professions. I definitely think there is a room for a lot more partnership and engagement between, say, social workers and archives. I know we've seen some discussions of that, I think mostly in public libraries, sort of so far, at least what we're aware of in Australia. So I think there's definitely a lot more scope to be engaging directly with, professionals and working with them and getting more advice from them. And we're aware of some research projects that are happening that are sort of collaborative affairs between sort of, psychologists, social workers, and then archivists as well. I think as well, in terms of the boundaries or like what to do in the moment, I think something like a crisis support model is very useful for archivists. And I'm certainly very keen to see if there can be more training. So not in terms of psychological counseling or a social work response, but if someone's having a crisis, what skills are useful to know in the moment to be able to help that person just through that immediate crisis. And so I think, and I'm thinking of services like there are crisis support services, there are crisis support hotlines in every country, and so the types of work that they do I think is a super useful model for archives and something that I'm very keen to see what else we can do. Did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to say, I think we also see techniques from social work being able to be brought in, such as supervision. If it's something, if you're going to be dealing with traumatic materials a lot, like these should be set up as part of a workplace training. So there is someone you can go to. And one of the things we do very much advocate for is you need to establish it in terms of boundaries, like with your colleagues, how comfortable they are for you to share that. So like you're saying, seeking immediate support when viewing traumatic material, you can't just turn to the person next to you and blurt it out at them. You need to check that they're okay. Like I've had, I'm experiencing something, can I share it with you? And if they say no, then you shouldn't, you should respect that too. But hopefully you work in a place where that's already been discussed and that's already been established. So you kind of know who you can go to in that situation and you're not trying to work it out in that moment. And so that's part of creating these boundaries.
Well, and generally creating an environment where this is sort of the norm. And so, having, whether it's staff wellbeing or whatever the thing is on like team meeting agendas and it's just it's a normal thing to discuss. So then it's a normal thing to ask if it's okay to share, and you've sort of got a bit of a protocol in place for that. So I think a lot of this is all about normalizing this type of work and these types of, even at the level of archives make us feel things, and sometimes they are good things and sometimes they are sad things, and like being okay with that as well.
All right, we have a question here from Marie Ella. Do you have suggestions for incorporating the topic of trauma-informed archives in archival education / curriculum? She just said it's a big open-ended question, so I will leave it to you as to when you want to truncate that.
I guess we're laughing because I presented last week at the Archival Education and Research Institute, and we had like a 40-minute discussion kind of on this question. I'm not sure we resolved it, I'm not going to lie, but it was some really good and interesting conversation as a result. I think one of the things we've had a lot of discussions around is, obviously this is such a kind of broad conversation in that way. We were discussing last week how it needs to be kind of included in all the different areas. There's a lot of conversations around affect and person-centered archives, and it fits really well into those conversations. But also when you're teaching people how to do reference work, it should be in those conversations. When you're talking about cataloging, it should be in those conversations. So it's kind of trying to look at it in this really holistic way, and seeing how we can, kind of pepper it in, I think is the kind of look that we were discussing last week. And it's going to depend on different courses and things like that. I mean, obviously, one of the main things that was discussed is until it goes into, accreditation requirements, it's always going to be difficult for courses to include it because, they're so packed already, like they're so full of information. And we all get that. And there's always more things that it would be really useful and important to include. So in some ways it might be providing just like nods and inclusions so that people know that they can go off and look in other places, and they're even just aware. Because I guess the problem I think that the survey results highlighted is that certainly, like people were aware that they could, like everyone thought you could have a trauma reaction, but like no one then, like it wasn't being openly discussed. So I think just having that conversation with students is really important.
I agree, obviously. And I think as well, I do feel like educators, people are coming in, they might not have worked in the profession, they're coming in as students, that's their first experience of sort of learning about archives. I do think educators do have an important role to talk about. These are some of the potentials, these are some of the emotional potentials of archives work. And just preparing them for the reality of, you may well experience vicarious trauma, you may experience great joy, but you may, this might be my
watch really hates us today. I'm sorry, keeps talking.
What was I going to say? This is something that you might experience, because one thing that did come out in the survey results was that newer people working in archives, so those with 0 to 5 years experience, were less likely to speak out to colleagues or to peers to, report their responses. And that's understandable when you're new, you might be in a precarious employment situation, you're really junior, you don't want to sort of rock the boat and speak out. But we're also seeing that may mean that they're not getting as much support as they need. So I think if they were provided with more tools and information while they're still being taught, while they're still under that education model, that would maybe assist with some of that as they go into the profession before they've really had a chance to build up those professional networks that are then so important to ongoing support.
All right, we have a second question from Eleanor McKenzie. I love the suggestion to build self-care into a project timeline. Do you have suggestions for how to advocate for this when applying for external funding?
Great question. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting and a really tricky one, because I think that does go to a lot of the cultural change aspects that are still needed, right? Like it's not. So under the Find and Connect model, because we work with support services, we are expected to do wellbeing as part of, like we are funded to do wellbeing, and that's because they're funding support services who are doing one-on-one work with people who grew up in care, and we also get.
But we did have to advocate for it.
We did have to advocate for it, but now we do also get wellbeing funding. I think, it is, as I said, part of that cultural change. It needs to be normalized as this is just part of the project plan. This is how some of our money is going to. I know it's a lot easier to just say that. And even putting it in application, depending on who the funder is, that may go down better or worse. But yeah, I think it just needs to be written in as this is just part of the project. This is what's needed to ensure a successful completion of the project. And I mean, there's some really great examples of that. We saw a virtual talk recently by Gabriel Solis, the director of Texas After Violence, and he spoke about how they build self-care into their project plans, and it's staff can do whatever they like in that time, but the hours are built into their project plans from the get-go. But again, that was after working in this space and feeling these effects and realizing they needed to make it more structural, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. I did have something here that I wanted to share verbally, so it's in the record. Stephanie Arel, A-R-E-L, she posted in the chat that she has a book coming out entitled Bearing Witness, Mass Trauma and Memorial Museums, which is coming out in September, I'm assuming September of this year. And it covers archival work specifically in Cambodia. The research covers Bosnia, South Africa, U.S., Israel. The work apparently started at the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York, where she met Costas, our friend. And so just a heads up that book is coming out. I don't know who is publishing the book, but something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting because we are seeing, we've come from an archives perspective. That's our background. That's what we know. But, we are seeing these issues are common across the GLAM sector, as I would say. We were able to go to the Australian Museums and Galleries Association conference earlier this year and spoke to them about these issues. And again, experiences are very similar. Like I know we're dealing with different materials and different ways of, describing and cataloging, but very, very similar experiences. And yeah, we were able to speak to some people who are working at various Holocaust museums in Australia, and yeah, really, really similar in terms of, interactions with survivors and how to impart difficult information and, very, very similar issues. So I do think it is an issue, not just for archives, but across GLAM more broadly.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not seeing anything more in the chat. I will stick in a question for me, if that's okay with you two. And my question is more related to, did your survey or any of your work look at any differences between a collection that had for a trauma event that occurred in the past versus a trauma event that's very fresh? So for instance, I work in healthcare and I've been collecting COVID right it was happening and those kind of things. And we have people in our group that have documented natural disasters that happen in their community, other tragedies that have happened directly in their area. So has any of the work looked at a difference between direct impact versus, I don't want to say ancillary, but, that more being impacted by event that happened not directly to you?
Again, I think this refers back a bit to what Costas was asking as well, because I think that that's going to be in more of those free text responses that we're still looking at in the very, very preliminary stages of looking at that. Because, yeah, we did ask, again, people to share the experiences they had. And I think it's in those answers that we start to see people explaining whether it's something that they, experienced recently, or whether it's something that's happened before. I know anecdotally from conversations that we've had, I mean, I've certainly had conversations with people who've had or experienced all the different variations. And I think also it can depend on how closely aligned the person is to being a community member themselves, of those records. So if it's a more historic event, but they identify as part of that community, it might impact them more than if you don't identify as part of that community. And so I think there's quite a lot of variations that we're hoping that we'll see more of when we keep getting to do more analysis, I guess.
And certainly if someone, again, through their own lived experiences has experienced the event, they're then, or was somehow, again, part of the community, or was part of the event that they're then collecting information about. I think that that's another big impact that, is not well understood yet. So that will hopefully come out in the other survey.
All right. Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions. So I'll let you guys, if you have any last statements for us before I let you go. Looks like we're going to end maybe a minute or two early, which and there's been a lot of comments of thank yous and great work. So if you haven't, I'm sure you're reading the chat, but just want to put that out there. So anything from you two ladies before we let you go?
I don't think you. Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it. If anyone wants to get in touch with us, please do. We're always very open to having conversations and to learning more from everyone in the community as well. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. Well, hopefully we'll get you to come to an SAA meeting sometime where you can go hang out with us.
That'd be great.
American Archivist.
For sure.
You're a month too early for this year's meeting.
I know. We've missed out.
There's too many conferences to go to.
Maybe next year.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see where it's going to be.
Well, it's already posted where next year's will be, so you could go look on our website. So they're usually posted out. So thanks, ladies, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.